All right, if we could turn our Bibles to Proverbs chapter number 7. Proverbs chapter number 7. And I'll be reading verses 24 through 27. Hearken unto me now, therefore, O ye children, and attend to the words of my mouth. Let not thine heart decline to her ways, go not astray in her paths, for she hath cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Now this is the conclusion to his story of the young man that he saw go into the harlot. And he starts out this chapter, he begins the application of the parable that he's just told by saying, hearken unto me, therefore. He says, now that you've heard where lacking wisdom leads, now that you've heard what will happen when you don't follow the ways of the Lord, listen to what I have to say. It's as though he's gotten done with the introduction to the book through the first 6 chapters, and how his son needs to, just the basic outline of how his son needs to love wisdom and to search for the Lord. And then he gives a parable to illustrate what happens if he doesn't. And then he says, now listen to me. Listen to the rest of what I have to say, because now you can see why it's important. Solomon is here giving viable, obvious reason as to why his son needs to hear what he has to say. And I believe that I just realized as I was studying this last week, we always hear that this is a book written to Solomon's son, that he's writing it to his children to help them on the path of life and to try and give them a little bit of guidance. But as I was studying this last week, I've come to the conclusion, I believe that Solomon was writing this letter to his son to correct a path he was already going down. Because his son was already listening to people who he should not listen to, who were foolish and were headed down the wrong path, and because he was already headed toward doing things that he shouldn't be doing. He wasn't fearing God. He was sinning. He did want this kind of a lifestyle, and Solomon is writing this book pleading with him to turn back from his wicked way. I came to this conclusion because among other passages in chapter 19, verse 27, he says, cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causeth thee to err. In chapter 1, verse 23, he says, turn you at my reproof. In chapter 22, verse 21, he says, that thou mightest answer the words of truth to them that send unto thee. So there's people, I've come to the conclusion, I believe that there's people at this point in Solomon's son's life who are talking to him and trying to persuade him to go down the foolish path and the path of sin. And so Solomon writes this book to say this is why you shouldn't go down that path. This is the true way that you should go. This is the way of righteousness, the way that the Lord would have you go. And here's the blessings of following that way versus the curses of following the path of sin. I think that's very Solomon is begging him to turn from it by saying, listen to the words of your father. And that's also why he says over and over again, forsake not the law of thy mother, because he is. So anyway, I believe that's very important to understand for the rest of the study, because it really puts the book in perspective. Now we get down to verse 24, and he started by saying, this is the reason why you should listen to me. This is what happens when you do not follow wisdom, when you do not follow God. And I'd like to just reiterate a point that I already made a while back here, and that is just the application that we can make of this book being written from the perspective of a father to his children. God is very specific in details, and the direction of this advice from a father to his children can teach much. Not only that, but the Bible clearly tells us to respect our elders, but also those in authority. In Deuteronomy 5:16, Matt 5:15-4, and Matthew 19:19, and in other places, he said these are all passages illustrating respect your parents. In Leviticus 19:32 and Proverbs 16:31 and others. He says respect your elders, not just your parents, but those who are older than you. In Romans 13, verses 1 through 3, 1 Timothy 6, verse 1, Colossians 3, verse 22, Ephesians 6 through 5. Just for some of them, he says respect those that are in authority of you. Respect your masters, respect your bosses. And so, God wants us to respect those that are in authority over us. Now, for a lot of people, that's not really hard when we go to work and whatnot. But a lot of times, especially for some of us young people, it's very hard to think. Maybe not. Maybe not to backtalk. It's not that hard to not backtalk, especially if you know you're going to get slapped in the mouth for it. But still, a lot of times, young people have the tendency, like me, to think that we have all the answers. And now even me, I know in my own life, I just realized a while back that while I never thought, I would never say, I think I have all the answers, And I've heard people say, oh, life is simple. All the answers are simple. You can, just do this and it works out perfectly. And that's a very prideful statement for one, especially coming from a young person who hasn't really experienced much life. But number two, I've felt it in my own life. While I would never actually say those things, when somebody comes up with a dilemma in life, I find myself jumping to answer their question as if I know what I'm talking about. And jumping to say, well, this is what you should do. Here's the problem, here's the answer, here's what should happen. And just thinking about it, it's made me be a little bit more wary and cautious of what I say. Because while I might think I have the answer, while it might look simple to me right now, I know that's a downfall of the youth. And God says to listen to people more than we speak. So while I might have an answer that I think will work, and I still might think it'll work, it seems to be a wiser path for me to refrain my words, because I don't have, even if my answer is correct, I don't have the understanding or the experience to back it up, and I'm not even sure that it will work anyway. So, I think this is very applicable to us in life. Everyone has, and besides that, even more than just young people, everyone has the tendency to establish their own opinions in their mind, and by thinking that theirs is the only truth, they dismiss what everybody else is saying. We can say, well, this is the way it is. This is the way we might study it. We might not even study it. It might just be an opinion. But we say, this is the way it is. This is the way I've established that it is. This is the way I think it is. And we become so firmly rooted in that belief that we dismiss what everybody else is saying. We dismiss counsel that could potentially be better than our own, or could potentially be the truth instead of what we think it is. And we dismiss words that could teach us much. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 5, it says, a wise man will hear and will increase learning. And so we see that the whole basis behind this book is to love wisdom. And here he says, a wise man will hear and will increase learning. Therefore, we can conclude that without learning to hear, you cannot be wise. If you're busy saying whatever you want to say, and you're busy just telling everybody what your opinion is, then you can't hear and learn from what the other person is saying. And without hearing and listening to what everybody else is saying, we cannot be wise. That's why it says a wise man will hear and will increase learning. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19, it says, in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. And from that we get the principle that maybe we shouldn't talk quite so much as we do. Because oftentimes, I've noticed when I'm at work, I tend to, at first when I first started working, I was very quiet, I didn't say a whole lot. But then I got more comfortable, I started talking to my coworkers, and giving them my opinions on things, and giving them even what the Bible said. A lot of times I gave them what the Bible said. But as I look back now, I realize that a lot of the things that I did say, where they were what the Bible said, could have and should have been said in a different manner or with different words. Because I was talking a lot. I wasn't listening to what others said. I wasn't evaluating what I was saying carefully enough before it went past my lips. Because once it's out of your mouth, you can't ever take it back. And after it proceeds past your lips, whoever heard it is then affected by it. Whether they ignore it, or they like it, or they dislike it, doesn't matter. It still enters into their mind, and they think about it, and they're affected by it. If they ignore it, well, then they are not going to pay you as much attention from then on as they would have if you maybe had thought about what you were going to say a little bit more. And so we find the principle: in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. When we talk a lot, we tend to get into things that we don't know quite so much about, and we tend to say things without thinking about them quite enough. And so to hear is wise, and to think about our words and ponder them carefully before we speak is wise. Now, in Proverbs chapter 25, verse 11, it says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver." And from that we get the principle that the right word at the right time is not rushed. We might have to wait. We might have to refrain ourselves from speaking, but it's well worth waiting for. Because when we hold it inside and we ponder it a little bit more before we say it, we ponder what effect it's going to have on people, and how it will affect our testimony in their eyes. Then we can say it in a way that they will hear it without turning away from anything else you're going to say, and we can make sure that it will be true and right. Also in James chapter 3 verses 1 through 8, it talks about the tongue and how it says it's unruly, and what we say can cause great harm. It says, "How great a matter a little fire kindleth." What we say has great effect. Matt chapter 12 verse 36 says, "Every idle word will be judged." Everything that we say is going to be brought before the judgment. So we need to start seeing what we have to say both as less important to be said and more important to be considered. What we personally have to say to others might not be quite as important for them to hear as we might think it is. We want to say what we want to say. We think we're right. But to refrain a little bit and think about our words and make sure that they are right both biblically and with the right heart and said the right way, a lot of times that can get you in a lot of trouble. It'll have a much greater effect in the long run. We must be wise and put hearing what others want to say as a higher priority than saying what we want to say. The Bible says that we as Christians need to put others above ourselves. And that means also in what we say and what we hear. Again, the principle here is that, we're just looking at the principle of Solomon talking to his children. And how oftentimes that we don't like to hear what's being said, and we like to speak what we want to say a little bit too much. Another thought that struck my mind just a few days ago was just for younger people. This one specifically for younger people. If we speak now rather than here, then we will one day mourn the knowledge we could have gained when we realize how little we really know. Every time I hear an older person get up and speak, they say, every time they mention what they know, they say, "The older I get, the more I realize how little I know." And every one of them I've ever heard said that. They'll tell you, "When I was young, I thought I had all the answers. But now that I've gotten older and I've gained some wisdom, some understanding, some experience, I realize how little I really do know. And the more wisdom I get, the more I realize how little I know." And my thought is that, if we as young people are too busy establishing what we think in our own mind and saying what we want to say now, if we're too busy doing all that to hear what others have to say, then when we get to that age, we'll have to say the same thing. And I'm sure we will anyway. No matter how much you know, there's still more to know. So I'm sure we'll say it anyway. But if we do not listen now, then one day we're going to realize how much knowledge we could have if we had listened. However, if we do listen, then one day we'll be thankful that we did. So it's just important. It's important to really put a lot of emphasis on the principle of listening to what others are saying, because right here Solomon is begging his son to listen. And because he's going down some wrong paths. And if he doesn't, he will one day mourn the knowledge he could have had too. So in verse 24 we see, "Hearken unto me now therefore, O ye children, and attend to the words of my mouth." He's just begging his son, he's begging his children to listen to him, because what he has to say is very important for their life. And then in verse 25 he says, "Let not thine heart decline to her ways, go not astray in her paths." And here we see the direction of sin, the direction that sin will take you. Sin will both take us down and away. Now, just to illustrate that a little bit more, just to say a little bit more about that, it'll take us, when we sin, the Bible describes the Christian life both as an uphill climb, and it describes it as a race to run. When we sin, it's like taking a step back downhill. It's like turning around and going the wrong direction in our race. And that means that's strength that we lost, because we spent that time climbing uphill or running the race and then turned around, and now when we turn back around, we're going to have to go the same stretch of road that we already went. It's strength that was lost. It's time that was lost. We no longer have as much time to cover more ground as we did. We've wasted that time. And it will be harder to recover that ground because we've wasted our strength in turning around and going the wrong direction. And it's away from God. To sin is just it's away from the finish line, it's away from where we're supposed to go. It's to take the wrong path in a marathon. It's to go around the hill instead of going up it. Just very simply, to sin is to move away from God, and it's to move down a path that we don't want to go. And when we turn back around to try and seek God again, we're going to realize we have to cover ground we've already covered. Then I also want to see here the progression. He says, "Let not thine heart decline to her ways," and then he says, "Go not astray in her paths." When we choose to sin in our heart, when our heart turns from God even a little bit, then our paths will soon follow. This is why the Bible implores us to protect our heart above all else. Because it says the heart is wicked. It wants to go the wrong way. And in Proverbs 14, verse 14, it says, "Once we backslide, we will be filled with our own sinful ways." We'll start seeing when our heart no longer longs to follow God, we'll start seeing more and more all the paths that the world has to offer. And they'll look ever more and more desirable. We'll want to go the way of sin more and more the longer we stay in our sin. The longer our heart is not dedicated to God, it will be trying to pull us in the way of sin. The heart has to be dedicated to something. Some people dedicate their heart to the world and to the paths of the world. Some people dedicate their heart to themselves, which in the end leads to the paths of the world anyway. But only those who dedicate their heart to following God will be blessed. Only those who search for Him with their whole heart will please Him, or will do anything for Him, or will have rewards in the kingdom of heaven. After we're saved, we're going to go to heaven. But only those who search for God with their whole heart will be used enough to have rewards to throw at the Master's feet when we get there. In Proverbs 4, verse 23, it says, the heart holds the issues of life, and it must be protected. He says, protect your heart, for out of it are the issues of life. Because again, when we will go down the path that we set our heart to follow. And I can honestly say, in my heart, I do not want the ways of righteousness as much as I should. I don't long to follow God with the intensity that should be in a righteous life or in a Christian's life. If you think about all that He did for us, we're supposed to give Him everything that we have. And there's no better way, because the paths of sin only lead to destruction. As it says in verse 23, till a dart strike through his liver. That's the paths of sin. That's the way they lead. So only the paths of righteousness are worth following. But we can only follow those paths if we dedicate our whole heart unto it. And to not do that will cause great sorrow here. Or if we're that hard of heart that we don't feel it here, it'll cause sorrow when we get to heaven and realize how little we have to give Him who died and gave us everything. Again, when we allow our heart to slide, our ways will not be far behind. The Bible gives many examples of people who pleased God because with their heart they sought Him. Ezra, in Ezra chapter 7, verse 10, says Ezra sought the Lord with his heart. Asa, the king in Israel under him, in 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 8 through 12. Jehoshaphat and the king of Judah, and also in 2 Chronicles. Some of the Israelites, not all of them, also in 2 Chronicles chapter 30. And Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles chapter 31. There's a lot of people who the Bible gives illustrations of them following God with their whole heart. Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, it says, you've done wickedly, and I'm going to punish you for that, but nevertheless there is good found in you, and that you seek the ways of the Lord with your whole heart. God is a searcher of the heart. He looks at the hearts and not the actions so much, because again, the actions are a result of the heart. And so God's looking at our heart, trying to see which way we will go, what we are going to do, who do we really love. And when He sees that we really love Him, He will be more willing and more able to forgive us. Now, He's going to forgive us anyway, because He already has, because Christ died for us. But our sin won't have quite the sting. It will, I don't know how to say this. Just as long as God knows that our heart is to follow Him, then it will not be quite so hard for us to turn from the sin that we've sinned. We can control our heart, but we've got to choose what it is we love and what it is we're going to seek with our entire heart. If we do not make that choice, then we will either live a stagnant or a backsliding Christian life. Because either we're going to follow Him out of duty, just doing the things that we're supposed to do because it's the right thing to do, because God's told us to, or we're going to live a backslidden Christian life because we're going to turn and we're going to follow the ways of sin because we've let our heart lure us away from God. We should never harbor even a disposition to the ways of sin, but should pray that God would cause our heart to love Him and to search for Him. And indeed, we should push our heart that way. Because when we follow God with our whole heart, it'll be easier to follow Him with our path. So he says, let not thine heart decline to her ways, go not astray in her path. Because when your heart does decline to her ways, you will go astray in her path. Then he says, for she hath cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her. This gives us an example of who sin will pull down. First, I'd like to see that it says, many. She hath cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Sin is very powerful. It's not something that gets satisfied with one person or this person or that person. It's not something that's going to get... Sin will not get satisfied if it pulls down our neighbor. And if we're a child of God, sin really wants to pull us down. And the devil will use the sin of this world to lure us away from him. And while it might be fun for a season, it will never be worth it in the end. Sin has pulled down many people. And therefore, it deserves great caution on our part to watch for it and to be careful that our heart doesn't follow it even a little bit. This says, she hath cast down many wounded. There's nobody that sin will not take. Sin doesn't have any pity. Just because if we sin once, it's not going to lay off. If we choose to go against God for a moment, it's not going to say, okay, I won this battle, now turn back to God and then I'll come at you again. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to keep hitting us and hitting us and hitting us and pushing us in the wrong ways. And the more times we choose to go toward that sin, the easier it will get for us to go toward that sin and the harder it will get for us to turn back around. Sin doesn't care who it is that it pulls down. Just because we have some slight disposition toward it does not mean that it's going to be easier on us than it would anybody else. The sin that caused so many godly men in the Bible to fall will also cause us to fall because they have the same sinful nature that we have today. And it still wants the same things. We need to give it our full mind in heed and be careful not to go that way. And also it says, she hath cast down many wounded. Many strong men have been slain by her. Sin is very powerful. Not only does it want everybody that it can get, but it's also very powerful. Samson was pulled down by that sin. David was pulled down by sin. Moses wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because of his sin. She hath pulled down many, many, many strong men. Way stronger and way more dedicated to God than I could ever hope to be. That doesn't mean I won't try. I'm still going to try and search for God with my whole heart, as they did. But as of right now, and probably as of the rest of my life, they were closer to God and more disposed toward the way of righteousness than I am or will be. And sin still got a hold of them. And he says this because we need to give it great caution. Sin is not something we can dismiss. It's not something we can half-heartedly think about or go at with half our strength. There's a reason that God gave us armor. There's a reason that he felt it needful to give us a sword. And it wasn't so we could pick daisies while sin went for the stronger guys. We all need to be extremely careful not to let our heart or any part of us follow sin even for a moment. Because she's very strong, and once we give it just a little bit, we will continue to slide. And then the last verse says, for her house is the way to hell, going down into the chambers of death. This is very simple. It's it's not a whole lot of expounding that you can do on this verse. Very simply, sin leads to destruction. It might be fun for a moment. We might enjoy what we're doing for just a second. But in the end, those that allow sin to control them before they get saved will go to hell. And for the Christian that allows sin to control them, there will be much, much wailing when we get to heaven. Many tears. Because we didn't do what we were supposed to do. We didn't accomplish what God gave us to accomplish. And now we've got to spend an eternity with a God who we did not serve in the time we were given. That's not a nice thought. I don't know about you, but that scares me to death. There's a reason the Bible says that the fear of the Lord is to guide our actions. Yes, love of God is very powerful and will help us make a lot of right decisions. But the fear of the Lord is spoken of many more times than the love of the Lord. After the commandments of God in the Old Testament, in the law that He gave the Jews, He said over and over and over again, I am the Lord, fear ye me. Fear the Lord. Do this out of your fear for the Lord. You know, we need to realize what kind of a God it is that we serve. We don't serve a God who's up in heaven doing whatever until it's time to take us home, being passive. We serve a God who is right next to us, seeing everything that we do, every moment of the day. We serve a God who looks into our heart and sees which way we truly want to go. We can't fool God. You know, there's a lot of people who live a Christian life while they're with their family or even their entire life because they know there's people that want them to. But with their heart, they do not truly seek God. They don't truly want to follow Him. And while they might get away with it here on earth, God still knows. That's something we need to fear. That God knows the true intentions of our heart. And that we're going to heaven to spend an eternity with Him. The Master is coming back, as is the parable in Matthew where the Master gave 3 different servants money to see what they would do with it when He came back. He is coming back. We don't know when, but He is. And if He doesn't come back before we die, then we're going to Him. But either way, we're going to end up standing before Him and giving account of what we've done. All the way down to every idle word. Even more than that, He's watching what we're doing right now. There's a reason that in 2 Chronicles, I'm not sure what verse it is, but it says, God is searching, looking for a man or a woman, whoever, looking for whoever is searching for Him with their heart and wanting to serve Him. He's not going to change us into the person that He wants us to be. He wants us, out of love and fear of Him, to change ourselves. And to say, use me in whatever capacity that you wish. And so, you know, this verse says, her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. For the Jews, that was very true, because they didn't have, you know, their sin was not already forgiven. Our sin, all the sin that we will commit in our entire life, is already forgiven. It was already washed clean. We still have to ask forgiveness, but it was already forgiven. The price was already paid. For them, sin had a lot more consequence. That's why there's several times in the law He says, if you do this, then you will bear your sin. He meant I won't forgive it. So what they did had a lot more consequence. And so for them, it really meant that it was the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. Because they would continue to slide down that way and not ask forgiveness of God. And wallow in their sin, having fun for a season, until they realize that there is no turning back. But for us, it's not leading quite to hell or to the chambers of death. We all die because of sin, because of the consequences of sin, but it will lead us to a leanness of soul, to a life without God. When we do things just out of duty and not because we want to please God, then one day we're going to realize we don't really have Him speaking to us. He stopped trying to tell us what to do because we weren't listening in the first place. And we're going to have a miserable life here on earth. When we get to heaven, it's not going to get a whole lot better because we don't have any rewards. So anyway, just to recap, she says, "Hearken unto me now, therefore, O ye children, and attend to the words of my mouth. Listen to me, for what I have to say is important. Let not thine heart decline to her ways, go not astray in her paths." Don't even start to want the ways of sin with your heart, because then you will go the ways of sin in your life. "For she has cast down many wounded, yea, many strong men have been slain by her." Sin is a ruthless enemy and deserves our full attention. "And her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death." Sin leads nowhere good. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this evening, and I thank you for allowing us to be here. I thank you for your word and for the counsel that it gives us, and I pray you that you would just guide us and help us to follow you with our whole heart. In your name I pray, amen.